It's one of the first major crossover events. There were major character deaths.
The comic book is not great for Supergirl. It doesn't end well for her.
At the time we did it, was like, how could you kill Supergirl? She's my favorite character. When was the last time you read one? 1941?
In 1985, DC had a crisis in continuity. Trying to understand what was going on in the DC Multiverse was an exercise in frustration. Writer Marv Wolfman agreed, and he had an idea. That idea turned into one of the biggest and best events in the history of comics. Crisis on Infinite Earths not only hit the reset button on the DC Universe, it raised the stakes across the entire comics industry. Supergirl died. So did Barry Allen. Crisis would become shorthand for high-concept epic storytelling, its impact extending now beyond comics into television.
There's a wave of antimatter destroying everything in its path until it obliterates all reality.
Welcome to the Joy Zone.
Let's go behind the panel on Crisis on Infinite Earths. The origin of Crisis goes back to the early 1960s. A young Marv Wolfman, still just a comics fan, dreamed up a story where all his favorite DC superheroes would band together to fight a single fearsome villain, the Librarian. Shh, they can't all be winners, folks. As Wolfman explained in the introduction to the Crisis on Infinite Earths trade paperback, he actually pitched his company-wide crossover once he started writing comics in the early 1970s, only to be told limited series wouldn't sell. Jump ahead to 1981, when a letter from a fan named Gary Thompson was published in Green Lantern issue 143.
We like the idea of the writer being able to answer the questions that the fans ask. And one of the fans in Green Lantern said, DC's continuity is very complicated. Are you ever going to do anything to fix it up? And I wrote back, I'm sure we will. And that afternoon I was heading along with others to a convention. I got there way early, and I'm sitting there and thinking about that letter column, and slowly the entire story just pops up. It just happens.
The various Earths and alternate realities in the DC mythology were initially created to explain away continuity errors and retcon stories. For example, when the Silver Age versions of Flash and Green Lantern joined the Justice League of America, the original Golden Age versions of those characters were explained as being from an alternate reality, Earth 2. But in the 1970s, the multiverse became a storytelling nuisance as new characters like the Huntress, the daughter of Earth 2's Batman and Catwoman, became popular. Another example, when Dr. Hugo Strange reappeared in 1977's Detective Comics 471, the story referenced his last appearance way back in 1940's Detective 46, which would actually be the Earth 2 villain. You see why a crisis was needed?
Up until Crisis, everything was pretty much running on a course, even though they introduced the multiple Earths in order to explain the two versions of Superman and why Superman was created during the Second World War and yet still be a young man now.
After nearly 50 years, DC's continuity had become a labyrinth that was next to impossible for new fans to navigate. In Wolfman's mind, the multiverse had to go. This story would mark a new beginning for DC. George Perez, Wolfman's partner on the best-selling Teen Titans series, signed on as artist and co-plotter. He saw the book as his chance to draw every DC hero and as a way to stick it to Marvel. He blamed his old employer for the collapse of a planned Justice League Avengers crossover. It was Perez who actually coined the name Crisis on Infinite Earths, a riff on the original Justice League and Justice Society crossover.
Crisis had a specific purpose. We didn't know it was going to sell. We didn't know, what type of reception it was going to get, which is, I think, sometimes the most exciting time to work on a book, when you don't know how it's going to do.
Crisis was announced in 1981, but because DC continuity was such a convoluted mess, it took years of research to finally crack the story. Remember the Librarian? Wolfman's childhood bad guy had morphed into the Monitor, a character first introduced in New Teen Titans number 21. Between 1982 and 1985, he would make partially concealed appearances in other DC titles, appearing to be an arms dealer to supervillains. The Monitor's first full appearance would come in GI Combat 274. This type of long-range planning was not standard operating procedure for comics in the mid-80s.
It wasn't going to be the same DC Comics that it had been when they grew up. Things were new, things were changing. It was now reaching your non-teenage years. You're now 25, 30 years old. The type of story you like at that age is not going to be the same type of story that you liked when you were 8.
During those days, it was Marv, and it was Len, and a number of the folks in there. They had a lot of internal support, and they went hand by hand explaining how the story worked and how everybody could participate, and they spent a lot of time prepping for it, and I think that's what made the difference.
The Monitor had been scouting the heroes and villains of the multiverse to prepare for the arrival of his evil counterpart, the Anti-Monitor. Coming from an antimatter universe, he was destroying one reality after another, including Earth 3, which, if you're not up to speed on DC lore, is the mirror image to Earth 1, where the Justice League is the crime syndicate of America. Got that? The Monitor is killed by his possessed apprentice, Harbinger. The Spectre convinces the heroes and villains of the DCU to come together for the sake of all reality. And Earth 3 survivor Alexander Luthor Jr., a character created by Wolfman and Perez for the limited series, leads the heroes and villains of the DC universe to take on the Anti-Monitor. Each issue was packed with glorious artwork by Perez at his absolute peak. The detailed pencils and crazy ambitious page layouts bursting with characters made Crisis a visual feast. Wolfman considers himself lucky his Titans pal took the gig.
George Perez was the artist, but he wasn't originally going to be the artist. We didn't have one. George and I had been doing Teen Titans for years, so he wanted to go off and start writing as well. And I encouraged that because he was really good. But as I would tell him what we were doing, because we were still working on Titan stuff, he said, "If you don't have an artist, can I draw it?" I said, "Thank God." Thank you. Yes, that's why I kept telling you what we were doing.
When you think of how much story is in there and how many characters and how much emotion he was able to bring out, it's a spectacular body of work.
By the end of Crisis, hundreds of DC characters had been killed, and all that remained of the multiverse were 5 Earths. Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 4, Earth S, and Earth 10. They would all be combined into one single universe. In other words, mission accomplished.
Nobody had ever done something that was going to change the entire universe, that was going to kill off characters. There was no template for the Crisis. There was nothing that said, here's how you do it.
Wolfman was given a wide berth to craft his game-changing story, and that's mainly because several people in DC editorial didn't really support the project.
There wasn't a lot of help on the editorial side. Fortunately, Dick Giordano and Jeanette Kahn totally believed in it, so they could back me up. But I was the editor of the book too, and it meant that I had to handle all the other editors' problems, and I had to concern myself. They were allowed to make suggestions, but we did not necessarily follow a lot outside of the death lists. It was important that we do this correctly, not make it something that everybody would necessarily agree with. You want to show them that this is something brand new, and you're going to like it even if you don't think you will. And when you tell people this character's going to die, this character's going to die, this character isn't going to be there anymore, their immediate view is they're not going to like it. The universe at DC is a strong universe because we can create it as if from scratch. And that's one of the benefits Marvel always had. All those characters were created by one or two people all at the same time. And DC didn't have that.
Perhaps the most stunning moment in the limited series was the death of the original Supergirl. But if you're still mad at Wolfman for killing Kara Zor-El, get over it. The man had his reasons.
Supergirl comic hadn't sold in years. It wasn't that it was a cult favorite. Nobody liked the book. Supergirl prevented Superman from being the sole survivor of Krypton, and we were trying to redevelop Superman at the same time. The idea was at the end of Crisis, we'd have a Superman that had a whole new mission, a whole new concept, a whole new viewpoint and everything. Eventually, you could reintroduce a Supergirl, but if you do, you introduce her as if she's brand new, without the problems the current version had had. And that's pretty much what happened. It took 25 years or so for Supergirl to come back, and they did make all those changes. People were fighting for characters they hadn't read, bought, cared about, or anything, but they were suddenly buying the DC Universe because they no longer knew what to expect.
Supergirl's death hit fans right in the feels. Ask DC fans of a certain vintage to name a favorite comics image, and there's a good chance Perez's cover to issue number 7 will come up. Kara's death is the moment current DC publisher Dan DiDio cites as his personal highlight from Crisis.
I think that's the one that resonated the most. There's that iconic cover, and the story delivered the same level of impact inside as the cover had on.
The decision to kill Barry Allen, the Silver Age Flash, was the most controversial plot twist in Crisis. Wolfman is happy to lay that blame at the feet of his DC bosses.
DC asked me to kill Flash. I didn't want to do it because he was the original character of the Silver Age. He was the first of the Silver Age characters, and I didn't want to do that. I also felt that Flash could be fixed up. The problems that they were seeing in Flash were fixable, but they insisted upon it. My job was to make it as interesting a death as possible so that you care about Barry Allen.
As the 35th anniversary of comics' biggest event approaches, Crisis is coming to television. The CW's live-action Crisis on Infinite Earths is far and away the biggest crossover in the history of the Arrowverse.
Who the hell are you people?
We need your help stopping this antimatter wave.
You just told me my world is over, and you need my help.
We can beat this together.
I read Crisis when it came out, and to be able to bring it to life in the Arrowverse is the biggest honor I could possibly imagine.
Obviously, for our purposes, it'll be the biggest thing we've ever done.
We're having all of the Supermen.
Double trouble.
Tyler, who's just wonderful, and Brandon, who was one of my favorite Supermen. So having them both in the same episode, and it's just going to be awesome.
There's so much that's happening in this crossover that, as a fan, I'm just freaking out. Just that I get to see that, let alone be a part of it.
And it's so many dynamics in the 5 shows coming together. It's a lot of superheroes. It's going to be a lot of leather.
Can we talk about Supergirl? Because we just detailed how big a deal her death was in the original series. They couldn't. They wouldn't. Would they?
The comic book is not great for Supergirl. It doesn't end well for her. And actually, it's very graphic. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen. It's not going to happen.
Crisis on Infinite Earths fulfilled its original intent to streamline DC continuity. It also cleared the runway for John Byrne's reboot of Superman in 1986, Perez's reimagining of Wonder Woman, and cleared the way for Wally West to become The Flash. The success of the miniseries also showed DC and Marvel the viability of epic event series. Without Crisis, do we get the Infinity Gauntlet 6 years later? Probably not.
The multiverse was gone, Barry Allen was gone, Supergirl was gone, and they were all gone until I got into the job 20 years later. So therefore, you got to understand, it was a period of time that showed that these stories mattered and they held. And I think that's why the fans reacted so well to that.
The downside to the Crisis legacy, there is only so many times you can wreck, reboot, or rebuild your comics reality before your fans start to lose interest. DC would release 2 other parts of what became the Crisis trilogy, Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis, but neither had the impact of the first and still greatest Crisis.
The only lament I have about that is that it was so successful that everyone's doing it, but not, different versions of it, but not for the same intent. The intention was at the time to try to clean up the DC universe, not because we wanted to make a big event, but that they thought that the DC universe needed to be simplified a bit. Obviously, they want books to sell the way that Crisis did, but sometimes that becomes the intention. That Crisis on Earth $. I joke about it. You say, what Earth does it take place on? On Earth $. But again, it was a fun book. In the long run, not as successful and as far as long-term changes, but it was a lot of fun for me as an artist to draw.
Considering the current muddled state of DC's continuity, it may be time for another crisis. The company is currently working on an overall timeline to organize its characters and history by eras. Not much is known yet, but we have seen part of the timeline.
That's probably one of our great failings right now, is that we are in such a quicker cycle to recycle characters and recycle stories that the events are much more fast and furious, and the hold or the effect that they have becomes shortened. And we're very much aware of that. As a matter of fact, we've been building a brand new timeline for the DC Universe that takes into all accounts all the major events and stories, and Crisis is an integral part of moving one generation to the next. And we actually brought Marv Wolfman in to do a TED Talk about what it likes to be in a crisis, how do you build a crisis, and how do you manage coming out of a crisis.
Much of Crisis was created to get rid of that continuity. Everyone thinks it's the greatest continuity story of all. No, the idea was to get rid of all that stuff so that you become fresh and you can make all new sorts of problems and errors and changes along the way.
Got a favorite moment from Crisis on Infinite Earths? Of course you do. Which death shook you up the most? Tell us about it in the comments, or hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. That's a wrap on this week's Behind the Panel. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more awesome comics-related videos. And remember, Behind the Panel isn't just a video series. We also have a weekly column at SYFYWire.com, as well as an amazing audio documentary series. Listen and subscribe to Behind the Panel wherever you get your podcasts.